Hey, welcome to Monday. It means it's time to take a look at the business aspects on Mansfield today. And with those details, here's Chris Gibbons.
Thank you, Jeremy, and good morning. Yes, our guest, Financial Times journalist Simon Mundy, who has just published an astonishing new book called Race for Tomorrow, with the subheading Survival, Innovation and Profit on the front lines of the climate crisis. Joining us from the UK, Simon Mundy, welcome to you. First of all, let's get this one out of the way right up front. The climate crisis is real. You have been to no less than 26 countries to research your book. You have seen the effects everywhere you've been. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think this is something that I, like many of us, had been somewhat confused about. There's so much noise around this subject. So I wanted to see for myself what's happening, but also what are people doing about it. So I set out on this journey, as you say, and it's very clear that wherever you go in the world now, people are treating this not as something which is some sort of slow burning crisis that we're going to have to think about in 2050 and our grandchildren are going to face this and that struggle. People are responding to it right now. And so on the one hand, I really came across the extraordinary power of the problems that we're facing. But I also saw a lot of really exciting examples of the sort of resourcefulness and ingenuity that people are marshalling in response.
I was struck by the way you balance the impact of the climate crisis, melting permafrost in Siberia, for example, fast disappearing ice in Greenland, with the economic opportunities thrown up, literally thrown up, in the shape of woolly mammoth tusks in Siberia. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was one of the most extraordinary parts of my research. So I went to a place called Yakutia, which is way up in the far northeast of Siberia. It's getting towards Alaska. So this is remote even by Siberian standards. And Siberia largely consists of permafrost, so frozen ground that's been frozen ever since the end of the last ice age, more than 10,000 years ago. And that permafrost is now thawing. It's enormous. It's the size, the Russian permafrost zone is the size of China plus Afghanistan plus Nigeria. And it's thawing out, much like the food in your freezer would thaw out if you switched off the freezer on a hot day. And that is releasing enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and methane. But it's also exposing the ancient remains of woolly mammoths, which used to roam all over that area of the world. And for various people in that part of the world, this is very lucrative. You find these mammoth tusks. There's huge demand for ivory in China, especially these enormous long mammoth tusks, much longer than the tusks of modern elephants. So I set out on a boat ride for about 15 hours down this river in this little boat, and I came across one of these illegal mammoth tusk hunting camps, where these men go for months at a time into the wilderness, these sort of insect-infested hideouts where they're hiding from the police. And yeah, they're finding tusks that they can sell to these traders, which end up finally engraved in casinos in Macau, hotels in Hong Kong. And one of them said to me, you know, the gold rush in California, well, this is the tusk rush. And it was an example of how in the most unexpected and little known parts of the world, people are responding to this in good ways and bad, in positive ways and negative ways, but nowhere is untouched.
As you say, the economy of Greenland, suddenly no longer about Inuit hunters and kayaks, all about mining titanium.
Yeah, so big changes there. And this is something that illustrates the complexity of many of these stories. You know, some stories around climate change are just straightforwardly awful, but others are more nuanced. So I went to the very far north of Greenland, to a place called Qaanaaq, which is the northernmost village in Greenland. It's only about 800 miles from the North Pole. And the Inuit have been there for 800-900 years. They came across from Canada by dog sleds. Canada's really close to that section of Greenland. And ever since then, they've been living there. They forged iron tools using iron that was taken by meteorites that had smashed into the area. And their whole way of life really revolved around the dog sleds, the hunting on the ice. But now the dogs are chained up for more and more months of the year. For more and more of the year, they do their hunting out on boats because the ice season is getting shorter and shorter. And that's centuries old expertise in how to hunt on the ice with the dog sleds. They have people, famously, some Inuit communities have many, many words for snow. Well, the Inuit of Karnak, of this area of Greenland, they have many, many words for ice. There's incredibly rich vocabulary because you had to know the difference between these different sorts of ice, because it could be dangerous if you didn't. Now, the trouble is, all that knowledge that's been passed down through the generations is becoming less and less reliable because the conditions are changing so fast. And that ancient way of life is coming under threat. And now at the same time, as the ice season gets shorter and shorter and the open water season gets longer and longer, for some people, that's good news. So there's a London listed mining company called Blue Jay. And I met the CEO, he's an Australian man called Rod McElree in London. And he was saying, yeah, look, we have a project very close to Karnak, which is a titanium ore mine. And without climate change, it would not have been viable because there was not enough time to get the ships in and out to get the ore out and away for processing. But now you have that longer season, so it becomes economically viable. And I met the mining minister of Greenland, who said this is just one example of the rising prospects, especially for mining, because there's a lot of minerals in Greenland that had not previously been accessible, but also for other areas of the economy. And he put it very starkly. He said, culturally, the melting ice is a disaster. But economically and for our industry, it could be really, really useful. So that was a really powerful example to me of the trade-offs that we're going to see more and more as climate change takes hold.
Now, another massive project being built to stop the erosion of one of the key parts of Lagos in Nigeria, Victoria Island, which a large chunk of the city is built. The land reclamation project, if that's the right word for it, of Eco-Atlantic, which is 6.5 million square meters of land. Now, its developers would argue that this is how you mitigate against climate change, but not everyone agrees with them.
That's right. So this is really an extraordinary thing, and this is an example of when you just you get out to these places that it's not that easy to get to Lagos, but you get to these places and you just uncover all these stories that are going under the radar for most people. This thing is absolutely enormous. There's nothing quite of that scale and of that nature being built anywhere in the world, and it's being developed by one of the most controversial families in Africa, the Shagori family. They're of Lebanese origin. They arrived in Nigeria, along with many other Lebanese people around around 100 years ago. And the legend goes that they were heading for South America and they sort of got off by mistake. In any case, they arrived in Nigeria and they became very powerful under Sani Abacha, who was notoriously kleptocratic, stole huge amounts of money. And the Shagori family, their reputation was very closely associated with that. Now they're hoping that they will become known for something different, which is Eco-Atlantic. It's this project which has been built to protect Victoria Island, which is the commercial hub of Lagos, against erosion and flooding and sea surges, because the edge of Victoria Island was getting more and more badly affected by the rising sea level, by the increasingly powerful storm surges. So what Eco-Atlantic has done is it's built this enormous new area, which will have space, they say, for 200,000 or 300,000 people, which is all protected by a massive sea wall, which is one of the biggest of its kind in the whole world. So since they built this, it has had a really powerful impact protecting Victoria Island from these impacts. And they have yet to fill this new area, of course, but they say, well, it takes time. Rome wasn't built in a day. It'll take time, but this is going to be the new cultural hub for Nigeria. So we'll see if that pans out. But at the same time, there are signs that it has been worsening the impacts of erosion further down the coastline. Now, what had happened? It's a rather complicated story, but Victoria Island had been getting so badly eroded because the colonial Brits had built a barrier to allow shipping into the Lagos Lagoon. And that had meant that Victoria Island wasn't receiving a flow of sand from further up the coastline. But as it was eroded, Victoria Island, that was going to replenish the beach further down where poorer communities lived. Now, since Victoria Island, since the rich area of Lagos is now protected, the erosion that was happening there is no longer going to these poor communities. So they are now having much worse impacts themselves. And this raises a lot of really uncomfortable questions. For one thing, we're going to see big building projects all over the world to respond to climate change. Now, will they always disproportionately be in the interests of the rich rather than the poor? Were those communities down the coastline entitled to expect that flow of sand from further up the coast? There are not obvious answers to these questions, but it does really strike at the heart of one of the most important questions, which goes for all responses to climate change, whether it's in terms of resilient infrastructure or whether it's in terms of the energy transition away from fossil fuels, which is, are these changes always going to be tilted in favor of the interests of the more prosperous people in society rather than the poorer people in society? And these are questions that we're grappling with all the time, all over the world now.
Simon, one of the sections of your book is called An Age of Storms. We've been talking about storms. We've just experienced a massive one in KwaZulu-Natal province here in South Africa. Storms are getting worse all over the world. This one left over 400 dead, several billion rand needed to rebuild. It's hard to see the upside in any of that, yet there is one, the so-called catastrophe bond. What's a catastrophe bond when it's at home?
So this is something which was invented in the late 1990s, and it's absolutely exploded since then as an asset class. Basically, how it works is like this. Insurance companies, you offset your risk by getting an insurance contract, but the insurance company, in turn, they want to offset their risk, and perhaps they'll do that through a reinsurance company, in turn, that wants to offset its risk. And so the catastrophe bonds are a new way for an insurance company or a reinsurance company to offset their risk. So let's say they are worried, an insurance company is worried about its exposure to a particular sort of storm. Let's say a big hurricane in the eastern US. So it will issue a catastrophe bond. Let's say it's worth $500 million. And investment funds can buy these bonds. And the bond will return, let's say, 10% a year. It will give a nice rate of interest. And then at the end of the term, let's say it's 3 years, the investors get their money back and they've had their nice return, unless the specified disaster happens and incurs a certain level of losses, imposes a certain level of loss on the insurance company. If that happens, then the investors lose their money, or at least a big chunk of it, potentially all of it. So to some people, this looks like what you could call a disaster casino. It looks like gambling on catastrophes that could end up costing people their lives. But I went to Bermuda, which is the hub of the international catastrophe bond industry. That's where the largest number of the big funds are based. And people there were saying to me, well, you can look at it like a disaster casino, but you can also say we're going to need more insurance. And the insurance companies at the moment, they only have so much appetite to take on the risk, to offer insurance to people in places perhaps like KZN that are vulnerable to this sort of storm risk, as well as, of course, famously the east coast of the US, which is the biggest exposed area in terms of potential losses. But the more you can have investment coming into these catastrophe bonds, the more potential there is that the insurance companies would say, okay, well, we're going to have a bit more risk appetite, we can give a bit more insurance, and people are able to get protection for their homes. And from the investor's point of view, one reason why people are getting more and more interested in it, various pension funds all over the world are putting money into these products. When you think about it, if the US stock market crashes, all the stock markets all over the world are going to be affected, bond markets will be affected, real estate markets will be affected. But the catastrophe bond market is non-correlated because that depends on weather disasters, which are not affected by a stock market crash in the US or anything else. So if you want to have a diversified portfolio, you want to spread your risk, the risk of your investments, it does make sense. So I think it's a potentially very useful addition to the financial markets, and one that we're going to hear more and more about in the future.
No end to human ingenuity. And up in Iceland, talking of human ingenuity, a young scientist has a way of turning carbon gas from the atmosphere, the stuff that is threatening us, into something solid that can be locked down, stored, if you like, underground.
Yeah, this is something that we're going to need more of in the future, I believe, which is technological approaches to removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In the pre-industrial era, there were 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now there are way over 400. So we've got too much there to start with. So we need to stop putting so much of it into the atmosphere. That's really important, but there's already too much. And to the extent that we can remove it, that's going to be important. And we can't only rely on trees to do that. Trees will be part of it, but I would personally argue, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is also increasingly moving in this direction, we need technology. So what I saw in Iceland was absolutely fascinating. And this particular project has been getting more and more attention since I went. Iceland was created by volcanoes. It's got the most extraordinary concentration of volcanoes on this small island. And that means the bedrock underneath Iceland is this sort of volcanic basalt rock. Now, if you can get carbon dioxide, dissolve it in water, pump it into that rock, because of the chemical makeup of the rock, it will turn into limestone relatively quickly, within a couple of years, as was proven by the young scientist that I met, who is now the CEO of this startup, CarbFix. People didn't realize it could happen so quickly. She proved it. So that's great. But where do you get the carbon dioxide from? Well, that's where Climeworks come in. Climeworks is another startup based in Switzerland, founded by a couple of young German engineers. And they built a system to suck carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They have these boxes, these aluminium boxes, 2 meters cubed, with a fan at one end and a sort of membrane in the middle. So they suck the carbon dioxide through, it gets stuck to that sort of membrane, and then the box closes, and then you've just got a box full of carbon dioxide. So you combine these two things, and you've got a system that can suck carbon dioxide in from the air and turn it into underground stone. And that's now happening in Iceland. They're expanding it more and more. They've just raised 650 million euros just a few weeks ago. Now, the scale that would be needed for this is huge. So one of these boxes can suck about 50 tons of carbon dioxide per year from the atmosphere. Total greenhouse gas emissions in the world at the moment are about 50 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that means to cancel that out, you need 1 billion of these boxes, which sounds completely ridiculous, right? And I said this to Christoph Gebald, who's one of the founders of Climeworks. And he said, well, yeah, you can think of it that way, or you can think we as humanity make almost 100 million passenger cars every year. And our boxes are easier to make than a passenger car. So if humanity wanted to build carbon capture machines on that scale, we could. So what was interesting to me was that is the scale on which some of these entrepreneurs are thinking. And perhaps that's the scale on which humanity needs to be thinking in terms of rolling out technology to tackle the climate crisis.
There we're going to leave it, but it's an optimistic note. We may just be smart enough, willing enough, driven enough to turn this thing around. Simon Mundy, thank you for joining us. Jeremy, once again, the book is Race for Tomorrow by Simon Mundy, published by William Collins.